All right, Jeff Mackler, Socialist Action. Great. Okay. So, all right. So, you're running for president
Of the United States.
of the United States for Socialist Action.
That's right.
Okay. Tell me what that's about, because I read earlier. I was doing a bunch of research, and I read that you're not expecting to actually win so much. Is that the case, or
No, I expect to win.
you expect to win? Okay.
Definitely. In fact, we need a couple of good reporters in the White House, so if you'd like to come along,
If you,
we'll put you in the press room.
that'd be fantastic.
We'll make you our press secretary.
All right. All for it.
But seriously, I do expect to win in the sense of educating people about what socialism is about and how to change capitalist society. And if we can convince people that capitalism is irreformable, we'll have made a contribution to changing the world.
Right. Talk about that, irreformable capitalism, because it seems to me that, let's say Bernie Sanders, for instance, he ran on a reforming capitalism campaign as a social democrat, democratic socialist, however people define him. So, what do you think of that?
Well, our view is that all of the problems that so many people agree on, racism, poverty, environmental destruction, global warming, pension attacks, union busting, homophobia, sexism, destruction of Social Security, all of the social gains. In fact, the worldwide economic crisis that is imposing austerity not only on Americans but people all over the world. Endless wars, 1,100 military bases, $6.5 trillion loss, according to the Inspector General, of funds that the Pentagon budget, that the Pentagon can't account for. All of these problems are not accidents due to a particular candidate in this election or in the past 100 years. They're inherent in the capitalist system, a system that subordinates human beings and the good of humanity to the profits of the 1%, actually a thousandth of 1%. So the problems that we're all aware of are inherent in the capitalist system, and unless that system is replaced with one for the first time, where for the first time in history, the majority rule in their own interest through their own institutions for the good of the vast majority and not the 1%, until we do that, there can be no fundamental change in our system.
Right. Okay. So following up on that, what is let's look at the differences between like your platform and some of the other left candidates, let's say Jill Stein, Green Party, right? So I don't know that she considers herself a socialist in the same way you do, but she talks about some of the same issues.
The fundamental difference between my campaign and virtually, or not virtually, and all of the others, is that we want to abolish capitalism. We're a revolutionary current on the left. Right. We don't think that any problem in its fundamentals can be solved without fundamentally changing the capitalist system and bringing in a socialist order. Right. All of the other candidates, in one form or another, are for reforming capitalism. Jill Stein wants a kinder, gentler capitalism. Right. In the Bay Area, in California, Jill Stein urged a vote for Bernie Sanders for President of the United States. The history of the Green Party is basically an inside-outside strategy. They seek a smaller, more gentle capitalism. They want an FDR-type capitalism, a New Deal-type capitalism. They want to cut the Pentagon budget by 50%, which would still make it, greater than all of the world combined as far as military spending. We want to eliminate the military budget. We have no need to send troops anywhere in the world. We're for self-determination of all oppressed people. We don't support any capitalist wars, imperialist wars, wars for plunder. There's no such thing as a good war. Wars are inherent in the capitalist system because they meet the needs of the 1% of the oil corporations. So Jill Stein's Green Party is traditionally half Democrat and half independent and half safe state. And today, because of the pressure of Bernie Sanders, which I'll tell you, they've moved even further to the left. Although Bernie Sanders calls himself a democratic socialist, Jill Stein seeks to capture this deep mood of opposition to the effects of capitalism, so her program sounds a little bit more left. But for us, the second you say, I support Bernie Sanders, you're supporting the Democratic Party and the capitalist system.
Now, is there a major? I mean, I was looking some stuff up as well about like socialist parties in America, and there are more than one socialist party, right? The Kshama Sawant group, for instance, Socialist Action, or
Right.
right? And so, what are the differences among those different groups as far as that goes, or is there a move towards unifying them along one strategy, or how would that look?
Well, in decades past, when capitalist elections, which are rigged to the billionaires' interest, took place, we would usually publish in our newspaper, Socialist Action, a statement the last month or so saying, well, there are several socialists running against the Democrats and Republicans. We don't agree with them all. We work with them in common social movements against wars, racism, poverty, unemployment, for global warming. But despite our disagreements, we urge you to give them a vote of critical support. Today, for the first time in my lifetime, virtually every socialist group, perhaps one exception, has urged support for Bernie Sanders, for a Democrat, which is unprecedented. The Socialist Alternative campaign not only urged support, but campaigned for Bernie Sanders.
Right.
Initially, before Shamba ran as an independent and a socialist, we supported her. But before that, she actually asked the Green Party to run a joint campaign, which we would not have supported, because the Green Party is for reforming capitalism, and Socialist Alternative was said that they were a revolutionary socialist group that was running against the candidates of capitalism. So it was a fundamental reversal that we witnessed when Kshama Sawant and the Socialist Alternative Party not only supported but campaigned around the country, appeared on platforms with Bernie Sanders, and urged Bernie Sanders, no less, to join the Green Party. And the same thing with the Workers' World Party. They urged a vote of support for Bernie Sanders in the primaries, as did Jill Stein in California, as did the Party for Socialism and Liberation. All supported Bernie Sanders. So in this context, with a virtual collapse of the entire supposedly revolutionary left, we decided to jump into the campaign and use the opportunity to address people who are victims of the worldwide capitalist crisis, austerity, which led the liberal Obama administration to bail out the rich to the tune of $32 trillion. You know, it was poor progressive George Bush that only bailed them out to the tune of 1.5 trillion, or Clinton 1.3 trillion. So when Obama came along and gifted the corporations after 2008, the first 4 years, $32 trillion at virtually zero interest rate, and they pumped it into the stock market, not for jobs, for people. So once again, we don't think that the Democrats can be reformed. Take Obama, for example. He was the first black president, supposedly a supporter of civil rights. He's the world's greatest fracker. Under his administration, he signed, for the first time in the modern era, into law legislation that allowed the United States to export fossil fuel, natural gas, which was banned in the United States. Obama, under his administration, there's more fracking than anywhere else in the world. And as you know, fracking produces not only the regular greenhouse gases, but huge amounts of methane, which is 80 times more potent regarding the global warming than carbon dioxide. Obama, the progressive, is the great deporter, with 2 million immigrants deported under his administration. And as far as the jails, we have, under the Obama administration and previous administrations, we filled our jails, a majority Latino and blacks, with the largest number of people in prison on the planet Earth, with the largest percentage of the population in jail, and with the largest number and percentage on death row. This is under a so-called progressive Democrat. So to get to Bernie Sanders now, why did they run Bernie Sanders? Was he just an angry Democrat that said he wants to make things better, run on a left-wing program, proclaim he was a democratic socialist? I don't think so. I think Bernie was a consciously chosen sheep herder for the Democratic Party. Why? Well, The New York Times did a survey, for example, of registered Democrats and their opinions, and they found that 56% of registered Democrats, this is the New York Times, said that they preferred socialism over capitalism, whereas 32% said they prefer capitalism over socialism. A Pew poll said that 55% of all blacks in the United States prefer socialism, and some 30% prefer capitalism. And of course we know that at the height of the Occupy movement, some 70%, according to all of the polls, said that this country is run by the 1%. Actually, it's much less than 1%. It's a tiny ruling class element. So there's a growing consciousness in the whole country that people are being ripped off by a society that preferences the interests of the rich who control their lives. As you know, 90% of all new wealth every year goes to the 1% of the population. So these are the conditions under which the disillusionment of the Democratic Party has reached an all-time high. So they decided that rather than have that disillusionment be reflected in an independent working class or socialist or Labor Party or anti-capitalist direction, they wanted to channel it back into the Democratic Party, and they picked Bernie Sanders to do it.
You think that's the case? He was actually picked as like a
I think
people get
he
together
was
and plan this?
consciously handpicked.
Yeah.
His voting record is 98% Democrat.
Right.
He supported every military budget ever. He supported every imperialist war ever, although he claims he was against the Iraq War.
Right.
And he, in Vermont, no Democrat runs against Bernie Sanders.
Right.
When Bernie Sanders runs as an independent in Vermont, he has the endorsement of the Obama administration and the official funding of the Democratic Party. And if a local, quote, rebel Democrat runs against him, they don't get a nickel in that state.
Right.
So Bernie is a conscious reflection of the crisis of capitalism, wherein, like the Democratic Party itself, which is the graveyard of all social movements, they were very concerned that this growing radicalization, this movement towards black lives, this environmental movement would break the bounds of capitalist politics, and Bernie was there to make sure that that didn't happen. We predicted that on day one, not because we have some psychic ability, but because we understand the workings of the capitalist system. The Democratic Party plays that role as the firewall against social movements, as does the labor bureaucracy, as does to a significant extent the black churches and the Latino churches, who channel the discontent of the most oppressed back into the Democratic Party, in return for which the Democratic Party throws a few crumbs to put a new building or an extension or a program in these institutions. Tragically, it's similar to the environmental movement. Here you have the founder of 350, Bill McKibbins, organizes a demonstration of 400,000 people in New York City against global warming with virtually no demands, absolutely no speakers, absolutely no rally, but the march was led by Democrat Al Gore, the head of the United Nations, and 36 elected Democrats. So the appearance is that if you want to fight for the environment, you join this parade of Democrats to solve the problems.
Well, it is true there's no Republicans who seem to be on the forefront of any kind of environmental change or
Well, to tell you the truth, the Republicans don't have to worry about being climate deniers. The United States, the President of the United States went to COP21, which is the Conference of Parties of the United Nations 21st year, where they promised everything and they didn't have a single implementable mandated program to challenge global warming. Obama was there and said we're going to do A, B, and C, but the United States is increasing the production of fossil fuels, increasing fracking, increasing the pipelines, and conducting wars all over the world for the very fossil fuel whose continued use spells doom for humanity.
Yeah, I might be the biggest critic of local Senator Sheldon Whitehouse for not being against fossil fuels the way he claims to be when he gets up and, preaches to Congress, to the Senate every week. I wanted to ask you about specific policies, and I got these off your website, so I thought we could go right down the 10
Sure.
points. And rapid conversion to 100% renewable energy to stop fossil fuel-induced climate change. I've seen that there are plans done by a group of engineers that could actually say they could accomplish that by 2025. Would that be something you'd like to see, or would you rather see it divorced from any kind of... well, tell me about what you think. Tell me what you think of that.
Well, first on the facts, Mark Jacobson is a Stanford professor who did a study that said that unless we reduce fossil fuels by 80% by 2030 and 100% by 2050, the planet Earth is doomed and life on it is doomed. That is the catastrophe will be set in motion that is irreversible.
Yeah.
So those are some of the, and by the way, Jacobson says 2050, he really meant 2030, but he said 2050 because there are political problems associated with it. So we're really talking about, I mean, here we are, two sane people in Providence, Rhode Island, talking about whether or not humanity is going to be alive in 14 years. I mean, if we did this 30 years ago, people would say that we're two maniacs talking about the end of the world, or the odds of a asteroid hitting the planet and wiping out Earth are about the same as this. But there isn't a serious scientist, including the top NASA Goddard Project fellow Hansen, who doesn't say that we are on the edge of catastrophe. And in that context, we conduct fossil fuel wars with abandon.
Right.
We destroyed Libya, which had 4% of the reserve fossil fuels in the world. We are literally refraining from bombing ISIS in Syria because it is extracting fossil fuels from Syrian oil wells,
right,
and then has huge truck caravans to take the oil north to Turkey, where they sell it to fund ISIS for $1 million a month for ISIS. We claim to be opposed to ISIS. And when you ask the United States generals, well, why is it that you don't take out these oil refineries or truck convoys, they say, well, there are civilians associated with them.
Right.
That is, ISIS-employed, U.S.-financed, Turkish-financed citizens who are funding ISIS, but the United States wants ISIS to exist to the extent that it helps overthrow the Assad regime in Syria. It's the same thing in every country in the world. The United States controls and supports every dictator in Africa, like in Nigeria, one of the world's great oil producers,
Sure,
because they secure the resources of that country. What we're talking about, Steve, in reality, is an insane system. We're talking about a system, for example, in the Congo. 10 million people have been killed in wars orchestrated by the United States using the armies of Rwanda and Uganda to secure the minerals of the Congo. And that has taken the lives of 10 million people. And you'd say, oh, Jeff, 10 million is an exaggeration. But the truth is that the history of imperialism is the history of the genocide of the people of Africa. Right. Belgium was granted in the Treaty of Berlin the right to take the Congo as King Leopold's personal property. Oh, yeah. And he killed 12 million people.
Yeah.
I just read an article by Robert F. Kennedy Jr. who put the figure of the genocide in the Congo at 10 to 15 million people. But while the poor Belgians, the only place, one of the weakest imperialist nations, were colonizing the heart of Africa, the Congo, which is inaccessible by ships, the rest of the European countries colonized the coast and killed tens of millions of Africa for their mineral rights. That's what imperialism is, for their oil, not to mention their slaves. So genocide is part and parcel of the capitalist system from 400 years ago. Yeah. Take Mexico, for example. When Spain colonized it, there were 25 million Aztecs. Within 5 years, 24 million died of diseases. In the United States, 90% of the native peoples in this country, after the American colonization, died of diseases for which there was no resistance. Right. That's 90% of the population. It's very interesting that in the modern era today, in the Dakota fight back against the pipeline there, such a huge assemblage of native peoples who have, if I may say, a historic memory of the results of colonization of their country. So I conclude from this, and by the way, then you have Trump. And if you think about it, Steve, if I gave you a choice in the elections between Hitler and Mussolini,
Right.
who would you pick?
Might go with Mussolini.
You might go with Mussolini.
Yeah, might.
Yeah, I mean,
wouldn't
Mussolini.
I wouldn't love that choice.
Right, Mussolini, made the trains go. He didn't kill as many Jews. Hitler
Exactly,
only killed 6 million.
Right.
Mussolini might have killed 2 million, so you vote for Mussolini.
If I had no gun to my head, I had to vote for one or the other. Might go
Right, well, that's the mentality that the capitalist system instills in all of us.
Right.
We have Trump versus Hillary Clinton. Here's Hillary Clinton, who is the supporter of every piece of reactionary racist legislation that that's been passed under Obama's administration and Clinton. Hillary was a champion of the AEDPA. You know what that is?
Remind me.
It's the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act. Now, why do they call it Effective Death Penalty Act? Because prior to the AEDPA, which was about under the Clinton administration, he signed it, a full 40% of all of the state court convictions in death penalty cases of blacks were overturned on appeal to the federal courts. So the Congress wanted to make sure that if we're going to convict a black of murder, we want to execute them. We want the death penalty to be, quote, effective.
Right.
The Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act. So what that legislation did was they changed the presumption that the federal courts had to use in hearing the appeals. They had to presume the correctness of the facts found by state courts. As opposed to in the past, you had the presumption of innocence. Now federal courts had to presume that the racist state courts that had these convictions that were routinely overturned were correct. The result was the number of prisoners executed escalated until a mass movement developed of sorts that slowed the process, which the rich are trying to bring back again. So it's this kind of legislation that has filled the jails. And it's not just punitive. The jails are part of the prison industrial complex.
Right.
And that is the privatization of prisons is aimed at getting basically slave labor. Take a guess what the average wage of an American prisoner in a federal prison is today.
Oh, I know it's under $1.
50 cents.
Yeah.
Whereas Mississippi and Georgia is 0.
Right.
So here you round up black people, you put them in jail, you handpick or cherry pick the healthiest blacks, and you sell them to private industry at 50 cents an hour, and they return to the position of semi-slavery that they were freed from in a civil war 100 and some odd years ago.
I totally agree with the 13th Amendment to outlaw slavery at all, but that's.
So that was your first question.
That was first, but that's okay. We probably could skip some others here, but you talked about the abolition of the U.S. war machine, immigration, amnesty, legalization, equal rights for all immigrants. Is that just free border movement? Is what we're talking about?
Yeah, well, our view is that no human being is illegal.
Right.
We are for the abolition of every single anti-democratic law that restricts the right of people to travel. The only reason immigrants come to this country is because we've destroyed their economies.
Right.
NAFTA basically undermined the economies of all of Latin America. In order to pass NAFTA, Mexico, for example, had to abolish the historic provision in the 1911 Constitution of Mexico for land to the tillers, the ejidos. That is a revolution, gave the land from the feudal aristocrats to the people. That was the Zapatista rebellion, the Pancho Villa rebellion. And the precondition for supporting NAFTA was the massive privatization of agriculture, which meant that if Mexico was they thought they were going to be able to compete with American agribusiness, they had to wipe out small farms and bring in the most modern agribusiness in the world. And that destroyed the homes countryside of millions, as well as the Mexican capitalist system that began to sell Mexican workers in the maquiladoras, the border assembly plants, to American corporations for $5 a day or $3 a day.
Right.
But for American capitalism, paying workers in Mexico $5 a day was too expensive. So they sent them across to Central America, to Haiti, where they had them for $1 a day. When that became too expensive, they sent them to China, where they had they, meaning U.S. corporations, had teenage women working 80-hour weeks in dormitory factories for 6 cents an hour.
Yeah.
That's a good way to increase your profits.
Yeah, and we're still doing that.
Yeah, and they're still doing that not only in China, but Indonesia and Vietnam and Thailand and everywhere else
And we're
where they can
assassinating
have
labor leaders.
labor
Absolutely.
cheap. So we don't blame the immigrants from coming into this country.
Right.
Not to mention agribusiness. Like, if you take, even in the United States, give you an example of absurdity. You take the state of Washington, used to use Latino workers, but they began to develop ties with families and churches, and it became too expensive. Minimum wage, $10 an hour, and so on. So the apple pickers were transformed from Mexican population to workers from Thailand, who had no family ties whatsoever.
Right.
And they worked for virtually nothing.
Right.
Virtual slaves. In fact, it was so monstrous that the state legislature had to intervene, saying, we can't have slave labor in a progressive state like Washington.
Right.
So they passed laws requiring the unionization of Thai workers, and the employers signed these contracts that were incredible. They said if any Thai worker's parent was dying in Thailand, the employer had to pay the plane transportation to go visit, and the wages were higher and the conditions were higher. But if any Thai worker demanded that the contract be implemented, they were fired instantly. The United Farm Workers of America, once Cesar Chavez's fighting union, signed these contracts and never met a Thai worker. So basically, the lowering of the wage of not only immigrant workers, Thai workers, black workers, all kinds of immigrants, but American workers in general, is the precondition to solve the inherent contradictions in the capitalist system. When the profit rates are down, which they are that's why there was a worldwide capitalist crisis. We had a bailout to the tune of $32 billion, multi-trillion dollar corporations. We bailed out what was once the largest corporation in the world, General Motors.
Yep.
Because they couldn't afford to produce cars anymore unless the cost of labor was lower. So what we see today, casualization of labor, fighting back, to maintain a $7.25 minimum wage, cutting of pensions for miners, cutting of there was demonstration of 25,000 people last week in Washington of miners who had won historic battles in the 40s when they unionized the mines and set up the United Mine Workers Welfare and Retirement System. They wiped it out, saying we don't have enough money to pay you your fringe benefits. Pension cuts, Social Security cuts, incredible amounts of money to the military are all ways of fueling a sick system at the expense of working people.
Speaking of working people, what's your opinion of the modern, present-day labor movement? I mean, has labor existence? It's pretty disparate, I know, but there are trends where labor seems to support capitalism because they work hand in hand with capitalism, like building trades working to build pipelines, for instance, right?
Tragically, the American labor movement is at the lowest point in the modern era. Mm-hmm. The lowest percentage of unionization in the modern era. The private sector is less than 5%. And if you combine the public and private sector, and the public sector is under massive attack, almost got wiped out last year with the California Teachers Association case. I forgot the name, Frederick's case versus California Federation of Teachers. But the total unionization rate in the United States is something like 11% and declining. And with Frederickson, if it had not been for the unfortunate death of Justice Scalia, He was the fifth vote, would have wiped out the right of unions to collect dues, which they'd won, 80, 90 years ago.
Yeah, right.
It would have gutted public employee unionism, which is still happening, like you saw in Wisconsin
Sure.
with Governor Walker. The trade union bureaucracy, not the rank and file, are another firewall against social change. They are tremendous funders and organizers and sheep herders for the Democratic Party. So we are pro-labor 100%. We are for a reinvigorated, fighting, militant trade union movement with its own political expression. A fighting labor party in alliance with the oppressed, women, LGBT people, and all others who are oppressed and exploited by capitalism. We don't think we can change this world without the working class.
Right, of course.
Now, Bertolt Brecht once said, if you don't like the working class, you can always get another one.
Yeah.
Can't get another one. We have the working class that we have, and they are deeply affected by the crisis of capitalism today. We see them emerging as the preeminent future force for social change in America. If we didn't have confidence in the working class, the vast majority, who would there be to change the world? Well, the capitalists say, us. We just have to elect Bernie.
Yeah.
They call him by his first name as if he is our friend. Capitalist Bernie Sanders, who the day after he lost said our primary responsibility is to defeat Donald Trump.
Right.
And he stood up at the Democratic Party convention. I don't know if you saw him there.
Yeah.
He stood up and and he essentially said that every programmatic left-sounding point that he made had been adopted by Hillary Clinton and the Democratic Party. It was amazing that anybody could have a straight face when he basically said, look at my role. I have moved the Democratic Party far to the left. And of course, the Democratic Party didn't move an inch to the left. Right. And Bernie is still campaigning for Hillary, having kept his promise. And who knows what he gets back in return. Ralph Nader quoted Bernie Sanders when Nader asked Ralph's book, Storming the Party, or whatever the name of the Nader book was, Crashing the Party, said, Bernie, why don't you support my candidate? You're an independent. And Bernie said, I needed a committee post. I needed to be the head of some committee in Congress.
Interesting.
So he sold out for cheap. But let me say something that I only half believe.
Okay.
And I'm winking.
All right.
Could it be, as with Mussolini, who you, in my opinion, foolishly said would vote for?
Well, I'm just saying if I had gun to my head.
Right.
Vote for it. Yeah, not really.
But could it be that Donald Trump is a sheep herder for Hillary Clinton and the Democratic
I hear
Party?
those theories at times. Although he seems to be doing
that's
pretty well.
a conspiracy theory that you will allow me. I'm not into conspiracy theories. But in order to elect the most articulate spokesperson for capitalism, the bought and paid for candidate of capitalism, the candidate of the oil industries, the orchestrator of every war that capitalism has ever organized, the war that killed 1.5 million people in Iraq over the alleged weapons of mass destruction.
Right.
The supporter of every racist legislation. What has Hillary Clinton done for abortion rights, which are under attack massively against women, other than lip service, or for LGBT